Um, Hi, I'm Donna McNeil. I'm the Episcopal Missioner to Michigan State University and the Associate Rector at All Saints Episcopal Church up the street from campus. And today I have the great pleasure of talking with my good friend, Debbie Royals, the Canon for Native Ministry in the Diocese of Arizona and Vicar of St. Raphael Parish in Benson, Arizona. Hi,
Hi, it's good to see you.
you too. What else would you like us to know about you? How
Hmm.
else would you like to introduce yourself?
Okay, so Leos and Chianiavu. My name is Debbie Royals, and I am Pascua Yaqui from Tucson, Arizona. I was born and raised in the old Pascua community, which is a settlement of Pascua Yaqui people that predates the recognition as a federal tribe, which means that since we were not federally recognized until 1978, I was Yaqui before Yaqui was cool.
Yes, and Tucson Yaki is very cool now. But
And as you said, I am the vicar of St. Raphael in the Valley Episcopal Lutheran Church part time.
well, that's right. I
I
forgot it was an ecumenical congregation.
Yes, and I uh, am also serving on the diocesan staff with our wonderful Bishop Jennifer Redall as the Canon for Native American Ministry. And I also do quite a bit of work with Church Pension Group in the Education and Wellness Department. As an educator, I spent almost 30 years of my life as a nurse, and that nursing background, along with my spiritual background, has continued to be something that God calls upon me to use in working with clergy wellness programs.
I'll also say, perhaps by way of apology for those watching, that we have been friends for a long time. We've been friends longer than we knew we were friends, and we've been close friends for more than 3 years. And God just made us friends, even when
That's
we couldn't
right.
remember.
Yes, even when we weren't getting the hint the first or the
Right,
second time around, God just kept putting us in front of each other,
so that
saying,
we
"Hey."
yeah, yeah, you're supposed to be friends. So the danger is this conversation is likely not to stay quite as we've planned, but that's okay.
That's all right. That's okay. We
So,
can always have another.
indeed, and we will, whether it's recorded or not. Um, so in the previous, as you know, in the previous videos, we've talked about with Dr. Mindy Morgan a lot about Native communities here in Michigan and around the Great Lakes, the Anishinaabe tribes. You and I are both from the Southwest. I'm from New Mexico. You're from Arizona, and it's an area that lots of people are interested in, perhaps have driven through on the interstate. Um, or have heard about, but maybe don't know a lot about Native American communities in the Southwest. So, can you give us an introduction, a sort of a broad, that's a huge question, but kind of a broad overview, and then maybe tell us a little bit more about the Pascua Yaqui community in particular?
Well, Donna, I think what's really interesting is that when people think about the Native American tribes of the Southwest, it's almost immediately um, correlated with turquoise jewelry, silver jewelry, um, those kinds of things, right?
Some
Because
of which I'm wearing.
um,
Yes.
because this is where a lot of our mining of the resources of the earth come from, those kinds of gems in the Southwest and the silver mining. They are also very much a big part of the way that the Southwest was settled or colonized.
Mm.
But if we look at the history of the Southwest predating the colonization or the actual um, maybe perspective of knowing that we're in the United States now, there was a time when this was all one large area, still called the Americas, as we still are, but that's where the term Native American came from. The difference is that when we're talking about Native Americans of the Southwest, we're talking about a fairly recent history
Mm.
with governments, whether it be the French government, the New Spain government, or the U.S. government. For instance, Arizona became a state in 1912.
Mhm.
That's this century or this past century, right? So a little over 100 years ago.
Mhm.
So we are talking about a history that I know firsthand because it was a time when my grandmother
Right.
and my mom, who will be 99 next month, are directly involved in. And as I came along, obviously their history is my history. Their stories have become my stories. And we together are aware. So when I talk to people, I have to say to them, we're not talking about 1492.
Right.
We are talking a very recent history. The other part of this that I think is important for us to talk about the Southwest and our relationship with colonization, it is very connected to the missionization of Native people.
Mhm.
And by that I mean both California, Arizona, New Mexico are all areas where there were missionaries sent and churches were being built, mostly, and not mostly, all Roman Catholic in
Mhm.
tradition, that the purpose of their um, being there was, of course, to missionize the unmissionized people
Mhm.
or the savages that still
Mhm.
actually lived on. And we'll talk about that some more later when we talk about the doctrine of discovery. But it was very intentional to come and bring
Mhm.
Christianity to the native people. So you can see tracks of mission churches
Mhm.
that mark or demark locations in which there was um, efforts made, and beyond that is a pretty broad space that is not touched. So
Right.
we have some two very significant patterns going on. One that is very much related to the popularized areas, and then
Mhm.
those areas that remained pretty rural and out of the way. So for Arizona, for instance, we have the history of Father Kino,
Mhm.
who really traveled all the way up through the Sonora, Mexico area up into Arizona, and that there are several chapels that have been built. Um, and the same thing is true for California,
Mhm.
particularly along the coast. As you
Right.
probably know, that that coastal area was what was missionized,
Yep.
not the interior area of California. Um, and you can speculate the questions and why that happened and how
Yeah.
it happened and so on. Um, for Arizona, there was a watershed area that made it make sense, right? Because there were waterways, there were then resources available for life, even in the desert, that attracted the Roman Catholic missionaries to missionize in the pattern, in the way that they did. Um,
As in New Mexico along the Rio Grande.
exactly. And
Yeah.
waterways are very important when we're talking
Right.
about colonization and missionization. I don't know that in general that's a piece of the puzzle that people put
Mhm.
together when they think about history and why did it happen the way that it did. I think the other significant piece of this, then, to talk about the Southwest and Native people in the Southwest, is that there's also a big um, misunderstanding that many of the tribes that were missionized by the Roman Catholics are oftentimes described as Catholics. So
Mhm.
the tribes themselves, almost in their entirety, right? As
Right.
if you are like myself, Pascua Yaqui, oh, well then you're Roman Catholic. No, I don't have my collar on, but I am an Episcopal
You
priest.
are. Yes.
Um, so those generalizations, I
Mhm.
think, are problematic. They're problematic in two ways, and again, we'll talk about this with the doctrine of discovery. But they're problematic in that the Roman Catholic Church is making that assumption. right?
Mhm.
All
Yes.
all Pascua Yaquis are Catholic in their mind, right? And the assumption again on the other side for people who don't know the history and don't understand our relationship to God
Mhm.
are still imposing as if somebody needed to bring God to us that we
Right.
didn't know God before. And I think that this is very true for you in New Mexico too, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah, and particularly there are it is a misnomer that I think many people often even think that all Native American Christians are Roman Catholic because of
yeah,
that history of missionization. Where in fact in New Mexico in particular, there's a huge number of Presbyterian Native communities because of Presbyterian mission outreach, as well as everything else. Native
right,
people live in the world the way the rest of us do. I was
right.
not born into the Episcopal Church. I found it along the way, and Native Americans do that in the same way that anyone else does.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it is different also from the experience of, I would say, East Coast and the settlements and colonization of the United States coming west,
Hmm.
because there was a period of time, as you know, that there was so much competition between the denominations
Yep.
that the government at some point stepped in. Not at some point, I could probably name the point, but they stepped in and they just divided up different Native people to different
Yeah.
denominations and just said, okay, you get all
Right.
these people and you get all these people and you get all these people. It's
Right.
kind of like, again, back to the doctrine of discovery.
Hmm.
There's that plenary power, right? We know what's good for you and we can take care of that for you. We'll solve that problem.
Right. That's why,
So,
in fact, there are a lot of Presbyterians in New Mexico, and I grew up Presbyterian
yeah,
primarily in New Mexico, but not a lot of Methodist
right,
because New Mexico tribes were by and large given to Presbyterians,
right,
as if
right.
tribes could be given away that way. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
So when you look at the ceremonies of the different people in the Southwest, you often will see what I call inculturation,
Hmm.
INC, right? Not ENC,
Right.
INC, which means that the two are existing and surviving side by side, right? So you go to a Pascua Yaqui ceremony and you will see elements of things that look very Roman Catholic
Hmm.
and including instruments like European instruments
Hmm.
being used alongside our traditional um, musicians and instruments, water drums, rattles,
Hmm.
and those kinds of things, and the dances and the music running simultaneously, not
Hmm.
separate, not this one
Right.
now and that one then, but both at the same
Hmm.
time, and creating this sort of confluence of music
Right.
and movement that is very unique. And that is
Right.
also very unique to many of the native tribes that were missionized by Roman Catholics. Um, I remember still when I was still working in the Diocese of Los Angeles, and I was working with the Tongva people who are the original inhabitants of the Los Angeles Basin area. We were invited, I was invited to go with the elders to the celebration of the centennial for the San Bernardino mission.
Oh,
And
wow.
we went to the mission, and I happened to have had a Maori guest with me at the time who's an Anglican priest that was visiting, and we all went to the celebration together. And it came time for communion, and we went up to communion, and I was wearing my collar, but I also so was he. We were both Episcopal Anglicans, right?
Yeah.
He received communion, and they walked past me, right? And when they were in conversation with the Tongva people, the bishop who was there celebrating said, this is such a grand celebration today of the Tongva people and their church, and the fact that they are part of our Roman Catholic family. And one of the Tongva elders got up because they were already incensed by the way that this happened
Hmm.
and said the only reason we're here is because our ancestors are buried in those walls. We built this church for you. That's why we're here,
Mhm.
to honor our ancestors. So again, there's this assumption
Mhm.
that there's a relationship between, uh, I think we can say in general, denominations and Native communities.
Mhm.
And it's a very complex
Mhm.
relationship that I think really requires some thoughtful conversation before assumptions, if
Mhm.
assumptions are ever made.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great cautionary tale, truly. Um, a reminder of, yeah, of these assumptions that we carry.
Well, and particularly, Donna, right now that we are, especially at this time of life in the world, where we are experiencing the very real and palatable tension between people of different races and cultures and traditions. Um, I hope that it is also a reminder to us that we have often moved quickly past
Mhm.
the discomfort
Mhm.
to try and find peace.
Mhm.
When true peace, the peace that we talk about in our tradition, the peace that passes all understanding, shalom, that word that is often used, um, is something that is arrived at when all the difficulties have been dealt with.
Mhm.
When you've had those willingness to have those tense conversations.
Mhm.
I always think of of course, you have great history with this, with the apartheid movement and Nelson Mandela and Bishop Tutu and the things that they have said to us and the
Yeah.
experiences that they have had, um, that they're modeling for us
Mhm.
has been, follow suit.
Mhm.
And maybe in this country where those kinds of things have not been resolved, we
Right.
might find some resolution. Yeah, I'm not sure
Yeah.
about reconciliation, but I am
Right.
sure that we can resolve some differences.
Yeah. Well, and if we're not willing to listen to this, and by we I mean white culture, if we're not willing to listen to the stories, then and the truth, not listen to the stories is sort of a lovely pastime, and the way that white culture tends to glorify or fetishize native culture, but really listen, um, and as you say, sit in this discomfort, then the idea of reconciliation is absurd.
Yeah.
I mean,
Well,
you're right, maybe it is anyway, but we know it is if we won't listen to the stories.
yeah. Well, and you and I have talked about this, that our diocese, our staff on the diocesan staff, did the Sacred Ground program that I don't think that before I did it with this group of my colleagues, I would have ever recommended it to anybody because I'm sort of skeptical of those kinds of
Mhm.
anti-racism, sacred ground, all that.
Understandably, right, yeah,
mm, yeah,
right,
I can be really bad about that stuff. But I would say to you, um, I hope that I also am better at listening to your experience
mm,
of my life
mm,
um, than I think I used to be, because the other side of that call and response kind of thing is that if we are only one of us talking and the other is listening, and it isn't a two-way street, there really isn't much to gain. And that's what I think is reconciliation, is when
yeah,
both of us have moved from wherever we started and come to this other new place. And it might not be here, right? But it
right,
might be closer here than it
exactly,
was when it started here.
right,
Yeah.
right, right. I agree entirely.
I think that that helps us now, if you're ready to move on
Yeah,
to the history of how the Episcopal Church and Native people have interacted with each other. The first resource that I always point to, because it has been almost like a history book. Well, it is a history book or like a Bible, is called The 400 Years, written by Owana Anderson. You can get the book on Amazon.
Mm.
It's available. But its title is 400 Years, an Anglican Episcopal Mission Among American Indians. And she goes through basically from the point of the first contact all the way through about, oh, maybe 25, 30 years ago,
Mhm.
and the history of the church, which is really remarkable.
Mhm.
Um, so the Episcopal Church has had an interesting relationship, I think, with Native people. Um, I've heard all kinds of speculations and maybe even these sort of Disneyland, Disney stories about, for instance, Matoaka or Pocahontas being the first
Mhm.
um, baptized Christian on this land, but we know that um, it was uh, not her, and that she was actually captured and taken capture on a ship. So there was exposure beforehand, right? But that the reception, I oftentimes think back to Jamestown, for instance,
Mm.
as the relationship that the Pascua Yaqui people had with the first missionaries who came to our community and were invited in to, to have a sort of a sharing,
Mhm.
as we always do, invite people, sit down, have food with them, uh, welcome them, let them tell you a little bit about
Mhm.
themselves, share who we are, and for that relationship that was established because the people who came to our villages in the very beginning were talking about um, Jesus and religion, and our elders were able to say, "Oh, that sounds a lot like our story."
Right.
And I envision that that's what Jamestown probably was
Mhm.
like in the beginning, but
Mhm.
that isn't the story that was written.
Right.
So the story that was written, obviously, as we know, had much more to do with dominance over minority culture. So the relationship that the Episcopal Church has had for many years, over 400 years, 500 years now, with Native people is really founded on that beginning,
Mhm.
right?
Yep.
Um, if we're honest with each other, that wasn't a good place to start.
No, and I will say that one of my grandparents' lines begins there. Um, I had one of my direct ancestors, landed near Jamestown in 1620,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
that is my history.
yeah. So we in the Episcopal Church have over the last 25 or 30 years done some very significant things. And one has been, and this was during a time when the Episcopal Church's presiding bishop was Edmund Browning.
Mhm.
His staff officer for Native ministry was Awana Anderson, who wrote this book that I just talked about. And she was instrumental in bringing together Native leaders from the entire um, continent to celebrate the new Jamestown Covenant and given the Episcopal Church's opportunity to apologize for its previous history and write a new covenant of faith. Now,
Mhm.
that celebration was followed by very powerful um, service at the Washington National Cathedral in 1992. The service happened on the Feast of All Saints.
Oh.
And the thing about that, Donna, is that the night before we did a ceremony all night long,
Mhm.
and that church was packed. It was,
Oh.
I think there were over 3,000 Native Americans in that church on that day making that celebration. And we made that uh, with the with the trust that the promises that were being made were going to be lived into. Now, there are probably those that might argue that those promises were um, upheld. I don't think that you would get the majority of Native people in the Episcopal Church telling you that that's true.
Mm-hmm.
And
I would.
primarily, one of them that is important for us to talk about is that the New Jamestown Covenant, of which I can send you a link if you need to read the whole thing, talked about full inclusion. Now, full inclusion at any level, whether we're talking about at church levels, at our diocesan levels, at our provincial levels, all the levels, that there would be representation and the voice of Native people always present.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, we know, you and I both
Yep.
know, that that has not happened. I've been involved since then, in actually before then, in Native ministry, and have sort of been the participant and the observer of the relationship and how it has evolved. Over the succeeding years after 1992, there were many resolutions that came to the floor of General Convention. Um, the first and more significant one that I think that is important for us to talk about is the decade of remembrance, recognition, and reconciliation.
The 3 R's.
We call it the 3 R's. And the reason that I tell you that that's important is because that resolution, when it was first put in place, it was put in place because people that were there at the signing of the New Jamestown Covenant weren't seeing the actions
Yeah.
that should have been taking place.
Right.
And then there was another attempt, right, of putting words into place in our laws.
Mm-hmm.
And then 10 years later, they renewed the resolution for the recognition. And then almost 10 years later, there was another resolution to try and renew it once again. And instead, there was an effort because of the energy that was surrounding the leadership in the Episcopal Church and Native Ministries at that time to focus on the root cause of why things were not changing, and the root cause being the doctrine of discovery.
Okay.
Now, so the way that I look at this now is this. So the 3 R's,
Mm-hmm.
the succeeding 3 R's, the every time that we have
Right.
tried, we're really good at resolutions. We're
Yep.
not
You are.
very good at living into the words of
Yep.
the resolutions with actions.
Yep.
When the Doctrine of Discovery resolution came to the General Convention floor and we repudiated the Doctrine of Discovery, we were the first denomination to do
Really.
that. And there was more written by other people about what the Episcopal Church did and other denominations that followed suit than the Episcopal Church has ever taken ownership for.
Wow.
So, what I mean by that is that they all talk about how phenomenal this step was, and we all,
Yep.
Episcopalians, are not.
Mm-hmm.
And here's when I left California and came to back home to Arizona. Um, a number of things happened that I think that are incredibly important. One is from a Native spiritual perspective. We Native people, always talk about our relationship to the land
Mm-hmm.
and that our identity is related to the land. In other words, that the land is a definition of who we are.
Right.
I am not going to be the same person that a person who is Anishinaabe
Mm-hmm.
would describe themselves to be because we are from different land
Mm-hmm.
and our land is different than their land.
Right.
So, one thing that I realized in that process of coming to this realization that even though I'd always said that, I didn't actually know what it meant
Mm.
until I got home.
Yeah.
And I realized that when I finally was home and my life made sense again,
Yep.
I even started thinking more clearly. And part of thinking more clearly also drove me to the realization that the reason that we can be so good at passing resolutions, but we are doing top down decisions rather than grassroots decisions.
Yep. I was
So,
thinking that when you were talking about missionization and the bishop in California, that
yeah,
that is a very top down kind of understanding of the world. I am here as the bishop, and we are in the Catholic Church, and you are here, so that means you are my people. You are the Roman Catholics, and
exactly.
and indigenous culture in general. My dog is having a fit. Indigenous culture in general. There's someone walking by. How dare they? Indigenous cultures in general. Are much more communitarian. That
Yes,
that
yes,
they tend not to be as hierarchical as Western white culture.
absolutely,
Yeah,
absolutely. And that has been in my clearer vision the reality of why some of the things that I have experienced as a Pascua Yaqui woman who happens to be an Episcopal priest, um, some of those places where I've served and some of the things that I've done didn't make sense, but some of them did.
yeah,
And you can see the difference between when and how I was doing them. When I was doing them because the people were driving what was being done, it was very effective. And of course, you and I both know that this is the key, right, to
yep,
all ministry,
yep,
yours and mine, all of us
right,
included.
yep, yep,
So I think that that helps us to sort of build a frame around talking a little bit about what you all talked about in the last video on land acknowledgement.
yeah,
When I talk about knowing myself now better and clearer because of the land, you all were talking about land acknowledgements and borders last week. It made me so aware of how fluid um, and relational we are in the Southwest, and how I feel when I am at my most natural self, right? My whole self.
mhm.
Um, and it
And
wasn't a
borders are a Western white creation.
yes,
Right.
right,
Yeah.
right. Because it also, with borders, doesn't allow any permeability. In other words, there can't be variation. So when you talk about the Southwest and you talk about land, so there, our traditions. Let's talk about prayer and traditions,
Mhm.
for instance. Prayer and traditions. In our traditions, we have been raised getting up first thing when the sun was just starting
Yeah.
to come to the horizon, not yet light and not dark, but
Mhm.
that liminal space, right? That you can't really define because it's neither of
Mhm.
the two. It's it's the clearest non dualistic existence of
Mhm.
time that we can have, and to open our day with that, in that uncertainty, right, and to settle into that uncertainty as a place of comfort rather than a place of
Right.
anxiety and conflict, right.
Mm.
We get up in the middle of the day, we stop and we recognize that the day is at its fullest.
Mm.
It's not going to be any more full than it is at that moment, right? On that particular day. At the end of the day, as the sun is setting, we have another one of those liminal moments where
Mhm.
we are given the opportunity to live in the non-dualistic tension that exists, that I think is closest to God. And I think that when they talk about other traditions, the Feast of Saint Patrick, the Celtic traditions of the thin
Yep.
space.
Yep.
That's a thin space because
Absolutely.
it doesn't last very long,
Right.
right? It's
Right.
very short.
Right.
And then, in the very darkness of the night, um, that's moving with the land, right?
Mm,
That's moving with the land because my sunrise is not the same as your sunrise, but it is the same sunrise.
right. Right.
My middle of the day is different than your middle of the day, but it is the same middle of the day.
Yeah.
And we have those things in common with each other. The border is the things like the time zones that
Right.
we
I was
then
just thinking
say,
that,
oh,
right.
yeah, you don't have this and I do. And,
Right.
that's different for you than it is for
Yeah.
me or whatever. Instead of realizing that there's a sort of a ocean of flow or a river
Right.
of flow happening on the earth, and we are experiencing the wonder of that, almost like a wave, right, that just keeps on going across. When I first came to the Episcopal Church and discovered the Book of Common Prayer and the 4 times of day on the offices that we pray, that we have morning prayer, noonday prayer, um, evening prayer, Compline, that those four, and I said, oh, look, they have indigenous prayer rituals, right?
Right.
This makes
Right.
sense to me. I can
Right.
get this. This makes
Yeah.
sense. The other thing about the land is that with the land and prayer, my prayers are different during different parts of the year.
Mhm.
So my prayers during the winter, obviously, there's shorter days,
Mhm.
there's longer nights, there's more intensity on reflection, right?
Mhm.
Because we're more quiet, we're inside. It's
Mhm.
cold outside. I know people think the desert it's not cold, but it's
Oh, it is.
cold. It's cold here today. You see what I'm wearing. The
Yes.
last time you saw me, I was wearing
Right.
short sleeves. It
Yeah,
made you
you're
feel
bundled up
really
too.
bad when you were bundled up, right?
Right.
But anyway, but we tend to come inside and be internal and reflective, and that is perfect for the season of Lent, for instance, as we're going into quiet times. There's movement. You can relate to seasons of the church and the land movement if you're looking at it from an indigenous perspective,
Mhm.
right? During the spring season, we're praying very differently, right? Because there's awesome stuff happening.
Yeah.
It's like the gospel reading for this coming Sunday when we're talking about the things that must die in order for there to be life.
Right.
And I said,
Right.
stop looking at this in
Right.
such a dualistic way that we're talking about an end and a beginning. This is a continuum of life,
Mhm.
but the life as it existed in this form no longer exists, but it has a new form. Jesus didn't die on the cross, his
Mhm.
body died. His spirit is still alive. It has always been alive. He didn't go anywhere. Kind of has a lot to do with the way that the earth is
Yeah.
recreating herself again. In the summertime, it's very warm during the day in the desert, and we
Mhm.
tend to be inactive at the hottest part of the day because, again, we're responding to the land, and
Mhm.
the desert gets quiet. You
Yeah.
don't see animals moving during the day. They get into the shade. They know to go underground. They stay close to water. We
That the
plant.
earth kinda shimmers
Yes,
that time of day.
yes, there's
Mhm.
so much sparkle in it,
Yeah.
right?
Yes.
And the way that we've planted our harvest, so we have like 60-day corn, for instance,
Mhm.
that grows, and it was planted on the banks of the, like in Tucson, the Santa Cruz River, because when the monsoons came, the Santa Cruz River was so moist and
Mhm.
wet. So for that 60-day period during the monsoons, the corn was being watered. We
Right.
weren't watering, we weren't
Right.
irrigating. It just grew because
Yeah.
we knew to go along with what the earth was doing. We were in concert or in communion with her, and our food was her food. She was giving us the nutrients that were coming not only from the rain, but also that were being brought through the washes in the river and the minerals and the things that were carried
Right.
along,
Right.
right? And
That's
then it
part of
comes
that.
into the fall.
Right, that's part of that cultural knowledge and tradition that Dr. Morgan was talking about in our previous
Yes.
conversation, that
Yes.
that, so many of us in the dominant culture fail to acknowledge, understand, or listen to.
And there's no connection to it, right?
Right.
Because
Right.
there's no acknowledgement. So I think that the important thing here is that when we're talking about land acknowledgements, we're talking about much more than people and names of people.
Mhm.
We're actually talking about knowing the land, and knowing the land is knowing the people of the land, and that those two are interconnected with each other. So there's two things that could be happening here, where we often talk about creation care or stewardship as being
Mhm.
one thing. Oh, and then we've got native ministry and we've got this kind of stuff, and
Right.
and when we begin to put them all into the same bowl and let them swim around with each other, they're not so different,
Yeah.
right? So when you were talking also about borders,
Mhm.
um, the thing is that the earth doesn't create borders. There are mountain ranges, and there are riverbeds,
Mhm.
there are canyons, and then there are sand dunes and things like that in the desert that are geographical boundaries, if we want to call them, to other parts of land,
Mhm.
um, but they are not borders.
Yeah.
A boundary and a border are not the same thing. And I think that when we began to use the word border,
Mhm.
we were insinuating the end of something and the
Mhm.
beginning of something else.
Mhm.
Um, when we talk about boundaries, and you'll know this very well from New Mexico, those boundaries change.
Oh,
The
yeah.
water changes, the
Mhm.
the direction of the water might be all the same, but the way that the river flows or the banks of the river are formed
Mhm.
depend on the water flow. The mountains are being shifted and changed all the time with the elements, the air, and all of what is going on around it, plus the movement of the earth, that it's
Mhm.
always moving. It's not, like so stationary.
Mhm.
There's actually movement going on. Boundaries are different because they do move
Fluid.
as needed, where borders don't.
Mm.
So when I said then, yes, let's talk about land acknowledgement. When we talk about Arizona land acknowledgement, and I'll want to talk a little bit about why we're doing it, because I think it's different than what you're doing in Michigan. In Arizona, when I was first raised up as the canon for Native ministry in this diocese, um, there was a lot swimming around in my head, as you can imagine. And I wasn't necessarily thinking that we needed to do things like it had always been done, because I had already seen plenty of evidence
Mhm.
that what we were doing wasn't working and it wasn't
Right.
a very good.
As you said.
Um, so we're talking about Jamestown, the three R's, the Doctrine of Discovery. And I said to myself, the best thing that Arizona could do would be to do the grassroots actions that should have preceded those resolutions.
Yeah.
And what would that look like? So we are handed in Arizona the fact or the history that there are 22 federally recognized tribes. And I always say federally recognized tribes because I want to make sure that we talk about that as a construct of the government and has nothing to do with Native identity.
Right.
Native identity is relational. If our tribe were not given the mandate
Mhm.
to determine people who were in and who was out based on blood quantum levels, we would not be making decisions about who is a member of the Pascua Yaqui tribe and who is not.
Right.
Um, and I think that that's
Citizenship is not an indigenous concept.
no,
Yeah.
no, no, because it's relational. Who was your
Right.
mother? Who was
Right.
your father? Who are your relatives?
Mhm.
What is your relationship to this land? Right.
Right. Right.
That that's how we determine who we are. and how we function with each other. Um, so I say federally recognized, and I said, okay, well, Arizona's history with Native people is not much better than most places.
Right.
Um, if we talk government to government, because we're sovereign nations
Mhm.
within a sovereign nation,
Mhm.
right? Um, that we should also recognize, Jamestown Covenant or not, that those promises and treaties are not being lived up
No.
to. And when we get to the basis of why not, and why the Episcopal Church got into the business of repudiating the doctrine of discovery, it was to begin to shed a light on the fact that the systems that we currently function under are all related to those original papal bulls.
Yeah.
And the basis and language, legal basis and language of the doctrine of discovery is called plenary power. Plenary power means that I will tell you everything that you need. I'll take care of it. You don't need to worry. It's very paternalistic and it's very hierarchical and dominant, right? So the U.S. government has plenary power
Mhm.
over Native people. In Arizona, the Arizona and federal government recognize 22 separate yet very often related
Mm.
tribes. And as a result of that recognition, have offered land trust, land grant agreements. That's what we call a reservation.
Yeah.
And that land trust agreement is a land trust agreement that is based on when that federal recognition was put in place. How many people did you claim to have in your tribe?
I didn't know that.
So the square footage of the square miles of each reservation is based on the allotment that was given to the people who originally inhabited that land based on how many people they had living at that time that they could document. Um,
Right.
Land acknowledgement for us here means that in order for us in the Episcopal Church, who are predominantly not Native,
Mm.
right,
Mm.
to recognize Native people, we have to first build on that recognition of what is our history, right? What is the history of Arizona with Native tribes? That's important to know
Right.
because then you'll know why there are 22 federally recognized tribes. And then the natural question comes, who are the unrecognized
Exactly.
tribes and why aren't they recognized? And that's all part of history. And then that's part of the first R, recognizing.
Mhm.
Recognize who we are. Tell the truth about our history. Know that this place that we call Arizona has been sacred land for eons
Mhm.
before Arizona was a state in 1912.
Mhm. Or in Michigan or the Dakotas or New Mexico or California, right?
Yeah, right,
Where the Episcopal Church is in all of those places and have
right,
passed these resolutions. Yeah.
right. So the second R is remembrance, right? In
Mhm.
order for us, we recognize our history, remember the people of the land. That's the land acknowledgement. That's
Right.
let us remember the people of the land. We can talk about in Tucson, for instance, who the ancient people we call the Hohokam, who were the ancestors of the many bands of O'odham people that
Mhm.
currently are living in Arizona and do have land grant um, reservations,
Mhm.
right? But that their ancestors, the Hohokam people,
Mhm.
were people who had no borders. Those borders that now are Arizona and Mexico, or Arizona and New
Mhm.
Mexico, or Arizona and California,
Mhm.
did not exist. And there was more relationship, right,
Mhm.
between the people. And so You can really see this when you study linguistics of the different tribes in the Southwest, and you begin to see how many are of the same linguistic groups. And then you can say, well, the likelihood then is that they have some similarities in
Sure.
their ancestral roots, right?
Right.
So that's the recognition and the remembrance, right? So, how do we get to reconciliation, Donna? We already talked about that, right? It's very difficult to get to
Yeah.
reconciliation.
If it's possible. Yeah.
But I can't undo the fact that they put these three R's
Right.
in place and skipped over the hard part. So, what the hard part is? Relationship.
Mm.
So, we have added a fourth R in Arizona, and that's relationship. We have, at this point, about 12 congregations who have, no, I take that back, 15 congregations who have relationships with 12 separate Native American, either reservations or urban agencies serving Native people in Arizona. They are building relationships with each other.
Mhm.
Eventually, we'll
Right.
get to reconciliation.
Yeah.
We didn't skip over reconciliation, but we're not focusing on reconciliation. It's something that people are very quick to do,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
I remember when I first was our Bishop Jennifer Redall was elected, and a year ago we installed her. And I think one of the very first conversations I had with her is she wanted to know what would reparation look like
Mhm.
in my mind, and it took me so by surprise. It took me a while to recognize that she was asking me a question that I couldn't answer because we were so far from
Oh.
reparation that I couldn't even have a conversation with her about that. But I could say to her, but we could start doing what is right. So, all of our congregations in Arizona, we did pass a resolution. So, we're doing, like our tribes do, buy up land around us and we'll own the land that we wanted in the first place. So, Arizona needs to figure out how to be the grassroots
Yep.
of that resolution, those resolutions that passed a general conventions at the top down level. So our actions are we're putting that resolution on the floor, and we require all of our congregations to name the people of the land, and to know our history.
Mhm.
We have a council for Native American ministry that Bishop asked me not long ago. I wasn't sure how you get to be a member of the Council for Native Ministry, and I said, I have one rule in my ministry, and it has been the way that I do ministry everywhere. I don't ask for anybody's Native card at the door, and I don't ask for their Episcopal card at the door. If they show up at the door, they're there for a reason.
Yep.
And I think it so struck her because she realized that, again, I was not putting borders in place.
Yep.
This is the Episcopal Church. This is Native ministry. Therefore, you either need to be Episcopal or Native to fit in this box.
Mhm.
I was saying there is a boundary here, and the boundary includes people who are Episcopalians and people who are not, people who are Native and people who are not, and they're finding their way to each other,
Mhm.
and we're doing something with that.
Yeah.
So that's land acknowledgement the way I would look at it. I know
Yeah.
that your conversation was a little bit different last video, but and it wasn't that it was wrong and that mine is right. It's that I have a different
Yeah.
experience of land and acknowledgement, I think, than um, the professor did. And
Well, and I think it's important to acknowledge again, as we said, but as has to happen over and over again, is that we are white outsiders. And so how we conceive of what that is and what that means
yeah,
is only one side of the story.
yeah, yeah.
And it's incredibly valuable to hear the other side of the story. And now to adjust accordingly.
Right. Well, so, and we're still adjusting, right? So we have
Yep.
a number of things that we're trying to continue to activate. that were top-down sort of things that happened. So the Episcopal Church formed a relationship with um, the Indigenous Theological Training
Mm.
Institute as a 501c3 very soon after that 1992 service. Um, and in 2012, that relationship got severed. And when that relationship got severed, it also impacted our ability to work within the construct of the Episcopal Church, putting together theological resources
Mhm.
coming from a Native perspective.
Mhm.
But during the time when we were functioning with the Episcopal Church, we developed several resources. One of them is the Disciples Prayer Book. The Disciples Prayer Book that you're looking at here is divided into sections with colors on the ends. You can see the little colors as I flip around because we're using the colors of the church because we also recognize that in Native traditions, depending on where you're from, we all have colors that are related to directions and to times of day and seasons of the year. And so we're emphasizing our sameness, not our difference.
Mhm.
This prayer book is divided up into the 4 offices, the 4 times of day that we pray that are the same, even though in the prayer book it's called something different than it is in the disciples' prayer book. And we created this separate from the Book of Common Prayer because I think we can all acknowledge that it is a pretty complicated book,
Yes.
that if you don't know how to do morning prayer, if you pick it up for the first time and look at the book, you might be
You
very
won't make it
confused
through.
and not know what to do.
Yeah, we did a
Um,
whole other video about that for exactly that reason, because you had to have a
yep.
whole video to figure out how to do it.
So the Disciples Prayer Book is not hard to figure out. You just go
Mhm.
to the color of the season, and it gives you all 4 offices.
Right
It's
there.
all plain, very
Yep,
spelled
very
out.
easy.
Um, the other thing that we were creating at the time, and we are continuing to look at how we might continue to bring this to the church, the big church, not the little church, not the Episcopal Church, but the whole
The
church,
whole, right.
um, is Native Theology, written by Native theologians. Our last volume of the first, it's called the First People's Theology Journal. Our last volume actually was developed as one of a teaching series using some of the very same topics that are used for um, uh, being able to demonstrate competency for ordination or lay leadership. Um, and in that last volume, we actually made it um, intercultural and interfaith.
Mm.
So there were no borders. There were Canadian First People. There were Aboriginal folks from the Australia, New Zealand continent. And there were people from the Americas in general. Um, and we decided that was an important resource for us to continue to develop because the voice that I share with you is not going to be the same voice you're going to hear when you speak to the people who are traditional people from the land where you currently are serving.
Of course.
Um, our it isn't that we have different gods.
Hmm.
It is that we have a different relationship with God because the land that we come from, the God of creation in our land is different than the God of creation of your land. Only that the land is different, not
Right.
that the God is
Not the
different.
God, right.
When we put all of those pieces together and we see the diversity
Mhm.
of people of the land across the world
Right.
that God created, and
Yep.
you think about how awesome is this?
Yep. That's why I love travel. I mean, you know that I've
Yeah,
been all over the place. And
yes,
and the reason I love it is because of that. It's very similar. I had never connected them explicitly. It's very similar to my experience of a starry sky. Uh,
yeah,
that the diversity I experience when I travel is a reflection of who God is.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. It just is so, I think, exciting to meet people from different cultures
Mhm.
and different traditions and to know, I was saying this morning on our Bible study for staff meeting is that, I had one of my parishioners' mother died this morning, and
Mm.
I had this conversation with her. Her husband died not long ago, and I had that same conversation. But I always say to people, um, this sounds different than maybe what you've learned as a Christian in the whatever faith you come from. But when I hear people describe loved ones who have made that transition back into the spirit world as, I lost my husband, really, where is he? It's kind of like, so I say to people, in our way of thinking, the creation was created all at the same time.
Mhm.
In other words, Donna, you were created at the very
Right.
beginning. You have always been in existence. You just happen to be in this physical form right now.
Right now.
Just like
Right.
I described Jesus on the cross. Jesus didn't die, his body died.
Mhm.
When our body dies, doesn't mean that our spirit and our soul dies. It
Mhm.
just means that the spirit and the soul that was in this body is no longer living in this body, but it's still here.
Mhm.
And all of us who have had loved ones who have passed on can demonstrate that connection to a loved one who has made that transition, either by signs or symbols or smells
Yeah.
or things
Right.
that happen, things that, that we
Yep.
can't, again, the mystery cannot explain.
And
Um,
yet, my experience of indigenous cultures, particularly native tribes around New Mexico, not
yes,
only, but particularly there, um, is that the way in which indigenous peoples value creation itself
yes,
also means that the incarnation is still deeply relevant. It's very different from a Greek Gnostic idea where the body doesn't matter because we're just spirit. It's
right.
it's a fusion in this life of body and spirit that matters a great deal and yet is not the whole story.
That's right. That's right. Well, it gets back to that sort of Western idea of dualism.
Right.
It either is or it isn't.
Right.
There's no in between. We have a really difficult time dealing with unknown,
Mhm.
and yet our experience, most of us who have had an experience with God, is usually in one of those unknown
Yes.
spaces that we can't replicate, define,
Mhm.
can't explain. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. I did write down as you were talking about the Episcopal acknowledgement process. It seems to me that perhaps we're working in the wrong direction.
Yeah.
That white people, white churches who have come to this land need to ask to be acknowledged and welcomed or invited. That that saying, "We interlopers acknowledge you and your people and your land and your culture in this place," is rather presumptive.
Mm.
And you were here first.
Well, and I actually thought about this earlier too, and it applies to today, the Feast of St. Patrick.
Right.
I love that people celebrate the Feast of St. Patrick because it is one of the very few times that I am aware that people who have Irish descendancy claim that.
Yeah.
Um,
Right.
as you also know, I've often talked about how interesting it is that when you ask people whose ancestors came from a different place
Mhm.
into this land, they oftentimes lost that connection to the land that they were originally from because we're all indigenous from
From
somewhere,
somewhere. Right.
right?
Exactly. Right.
But you will often hear people who have generationally existed on this land that they suddenly are Americans, and America is not an indigenous place.
No.
There are Native Americans,
Right. Right.
that are indigenous to this land, but it's like people who say they're native Tucsonans because they've lived in
Yep.
Tucson for 10 or 15 years. And I said, no, you're still a transplant. You lived somewhere else before here.
Yep.
Now I can say I'm a
Right.
native
Native.
Tucsonan,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
I
So,
was so today is also it is the Feast of St. Patrick on the day we're recording. It is also the day that Deb Haaland is it's her first day on
yes.
and work as the Secretary of the Interior.
Oh,
And it's been said several times in the last week since her confirmation hearing that she is a 35th generation New Mexican, which is
yes.
mind blowing. Um,
Yes.
and so as someone who is native to New Mexico, not native, but native, I was born and raised in the mountains south of Albuquerque, and my father was born and raised in New Mexico,
Yes.
which among Anglos is unusual for, first of all, anyone to be born there, but to have multiple generations born in New Mexico is unusual. Um, and then to hear 35th generation New Mexican, I just
Yes.
love that, and it drives home exactly what we're talking about.
Exactly. Oh, and on her final speech yesterday, when she resigned her position in the House,
Right?
she mentioned her 35 years
Yep.
of generations, right? And 35 generations
Generations, right?
history. And, again, every time that you hear somebody say that, it's just
Yeah.
so incredibly phenomenal because you know as well as I do that, of course, New Mexico, like Arizona, has a recent history with the U.S. that is not 35 generations back.
No, 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 it's
So,
100 years.
yeah,
It
so
is roughly,
that's
it's
right.
basically 100 years. Yeah,
Yeah, so you
one
have to
century.
acknowledge that who were those people that were there before then.
Exactly.
I have been working so hard since the 2010 census to get Native people counted,
Yep.
and then trying to also get um, the equal voting opportunities for Native people, particularly in rural areas in
Right.
Arizona, like New Mexico, which are many,
Yes.
um,
And
out in
vast.
a
I keep saying
well,
to people that the distances for those
oh
who are from the Midwest or the East, the distances are not what you imagine. They are
no,
vast.
yes, and be
Hours of
able to.
driving without seeing a either person or another man-made structure.
That's right.
Right.
Oh gosh, and to think about how those folks have not been given uh, equal opportunity to
Yep.
vote, things that we take so for granted because we live in areas where there's equal access to healthcare, equal access to the internet, equal access to water and
Right.
electricity and cell phones and all the things that you and
Trash
I
removal.
we just take it for granted, right?
Yep.
And I really appreciated Secretary Holland when she mentioned so many of those things that she has worked so hard to make sure there was representation because there was voice,
Yeah.
right? That
Yep.
somebody knew about these challenges, that it didn't go unnoticed.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So let's hope, and I pledge my advocacy to it, that having the first Native American as head of the Interior Department
yeah.
marks the beginning of a new era in intergovernmental relations between the
Yeah.
United States and the sovereign tribes within it.
Well, and the thing that I'm hopeful about, Donna, more than anything, is the fact that it's Secretary Holland
Yeah.
and our current president, because I do think that there is room for some of that um, non-dualistic thought. That there's room for both and what we started this conversation, hearing from each other and learning from each other and finding a way not necessarily to come to this, but to move from here to a little closer to here.
Mhm.
Um, And I think that that can happen um, with just the voices of those two folks.
Right.
Imagine what the the inspiration, of course, that this has driven into Native people, and in particular Native women,
Right.
um, who now feel empowered. Right, that
Right. Right.
we can accomplish some things. We can
Yeah.
make it happen.
Right. Right.
Yeah,
Right. I think that is as good a note as any to end on.
I
Debbie,
love
thank
it.
you so much. It is always a treat, of course, to get to hang with you, but I appreciate this conversation in particular.
Oh, Chioke Utasia, Donna. It's wonderful to talk with you and to be part of what you're doing.
Thank you.